Hello, good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with news that the Sarawak State Government will be setting up a committee to monitor the teaching of science and mathematics in English for primary 1 classes in the state next year. They're going to give it about 6 months to a year for the committee to monitor the move. In any case, Sarawak will be the first state in Malaysia to teach maths and science in English.
Right, and because what's really interesting is that they're saying that the issue here really is that there are many teachers who are used to delivering maths and science in Malay and Bahasa Malaysia, and so the question is whether they'll be able to do it in English. And I think they're bringing together experts and professionals to do this monitoring. So it's actually, I think, an effort seen as being kind of targeted at whether this policy will actually work and be effective.
Okay. Well, you know, I guess my concern is what makes Sarawak think that they can effectively implement this project or this move when in the past we've seen several failed attempts. I mean, 2003, Teaching and Learning of Science and Mathematics in English, PPSMI, if you remember, that was then scrapped in 2009 when studies revealed that students were just not learning because they didn't have the proficiency of the language. And then in 2016, we had the dual language program that allowed selected primary and secondary schools to teach science and maths in English. But that, I think that's only selected schools. But this is a blanket-wide, I guess, option for schools.
Right. I mean, what is interesting is I think Sarawak has, since I think the last general elections, been very vocal about the question of English being essential as a skill for young Sarawakians to excel in the world and in today's world. And so, and they've pushed back on the kind of nationalist rhetoric that is so often, bedevils the discussion about the kind of linguistic skills that students ought to have in order to be future ready, to be employable. All these questions are bedeviled by the kind of nationalist rhetoric of saying we need to protect the national language against any kind of rivals.
Yeah, so I mean the criticisms that we saw come out from PPSMI and the dual language program had backlash that it was eroding nationalism, it was eroding the mastery of the national language. But I think Sarawak doesn't have the same kind of hang-up perhaps that the rest of Malaysia might have.
Well, it's a hang-up, I think, that not so much the rest of Malaysia, but some cultural nationalists have and have imposed their views, and politicians are often very scared of them. And so, they tend not to want to make the counter-argument. Now, I think it also is an opportune time for us to discuss whether delivering language skills through maths and science lessons is the way to go. I mean, pedagogically, is it even sound to force kids to learn English not through increased English classes, not through English literature, which is the way that I think most sensible people will do. They're doing it through maths and science.
Right.
It's a curious route in order to promote the English language and help the mastery of that language.
Well, we'll have to see in 6 to 12 months whether this will pan out for the state of Sarawak. But still on this education theme, but more towards tertiary education, we have DAP Secretary General Lim Guan Eng saying that the Pakatan Harapan government wants a complete break with the past practice of providing funding for private education institution, which depends on its management's political ties. Now, he's saying that Putrajaya will provide at least 30 million ringgit in funding for Tunku Abdul Rahman University College only if MCA relinquishes control of this situation. Now, is this a step in the right direction for institutional reforms?
Well, again, Melisa, we often faced a situation where in the changes that happen, managing the way in which a government policy is received is very important. Now, this move might be seen as an attempt to basically to undermine a political rival, a rival that's lost recently the elections, which is MCA, and to promote your own political agenda. But and that might actually, in some ways, not be the purpose. The purpose might be to de-link educational institutions from political ones, which is something that kind of happened over the years during the Barisan Nasional decades of rule.
Are you concerned about the optics that perhaps the Pakatan Harapan government might look vindictive if they go ahead with this move?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one is the optics, and the other, of course, is the fate of young people, right? So if this becomes a standoff between the Pakatan Harapan government and the MCA, and the MCA refuses to relinquish control over Tunku Abdul Rahman University College, what will happen to the students? I mean, the students, will they be collateral in this tussle between political forces? And I think that's something I'm concerned about. We should never sacrifice the fate of young people because of the kind of politics of the day.
I'm just curious about the difference when it comes to the approach for politically linked educational institutions versus, say, politically linked media outlets, for instance. Is the government going to insist on, the management of media or the stakeholders of media organizations pull back?
Well, it's very interesting because political parties have long been involved in business, and this might be a structural problem that will take time to unravel, right? I mean, political parties earn a revenue through their business interests. They have companies they're holding companies that basically invest in various things, including the media. So Warren owns staff, for instance.
But I think the difference is that perhaps because this educational institution is asking for funding, right? Whereas, media organizations may not be dependent on funding from the federal government. Anyway, let's turn our attention now to the Tanjung PI by-election. Opposition lawmakers are considering a legal challenge against the Election Commission's new ruling that political campaigners are required to obtain police permits for their walkabouts, and this includes door-to-door visits. So the latest on this is that the EC has responded.
And Melissa, they've responded by saying that actually this is not something that they have imposed, but that the police force has imposed. So PDRM, Police Diraja Malaysia, they're the ones that have set up this new laws. And the question, of course, is, regardless of where it comes from, are these new rulings going to stymie the democratic culture? Are they going to increase bureaucratization? Are they going to create a situation where candidates have less access to voters rather than enable access to voters, which is, I guess, the kind of democratic game plan that we want. We want a democratic and electoral system that improves access, that does kind of a leveling of the playing field.
Well, that is the EC's job, right? But in the response that the EC had just put out not too long ago, it says that the institution tasked to keep law and order is not the SPR, not the Election Commission, but rather it is the police. Now, it's not within the jurisdiction of the EC to issue permits or to impose requirements for permits. It is the police's jurisdiction and power. Now, in the case of Tanjung Piai, the police has decided to impose a new requirement for permits, even for walkabouts and house-to-house visits. And the question is, why now? Why the change now? Why is this a new requirement? Yeah,
and when you look at the reports, one of the things that have said, concerns around the dissemination of hate speech or banners that might increase tensions on a local level.
Misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can understand why regulators might want to have some control of the situation, not have it a free-for-all. But at the same time, is the requirement to have a permit for a walkabout reasonable? I mean,
does a walkabout seem to be just almost a normal part of campaigning? Like just
it is.
Around?
I mean, pressing flesh, as they call it, is in fact a fairly standard kind of democratic procedure. The question is, if the ability to get a permit requires nothing much than a kind of a signing of a form, then perhaps it doesn't really matter. But again, it's the issue is whether we're creating bureaucratic hurdles between candidates and voters, unnecessary laws that in fact kind of undermine the democratic. nature of the electoral game. Yeah.
Okay, after this, we're going to take a closer look at the SRC trial of Datuk Sri Najib Razak. Make sure to stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back.